On June 29th, 2003, a 14-year-old boy named John and his best friend, a 16-year-old named Mark, were walking in this back alleyway behind a row of shops in Manchester, England. Mark had asked John to go back there, to which John was a little bit confused because it was just a dead end back there. But he went back there anyways because he figured, Mark must have a reason. And so they're walking along this alleyway when Mark suddenly comes to a stop. Then he turns to face John, and John's looking at him inquisitively, and Mark just reaches out and grabs him by the shoulder before pulling out a huge knife and drives it into his stomach and says, "I'm sorry, bro." Pulls it out again, drives it into his chest before releasing it and letting John fall to the ground. As soon as John hits the ground, he looks up at Mark and he says, "You're killing me." And Mark says, "I had to do it. If you knew all the details, you would understand." And so after only a couple of minutes, John goes quiet and he's laying still on the ground, and Mark would stand there just waiting for about 20 minutes to ensure that John really was dead before calling authorities and claiming some madman had snuck up behind them and attacked his best friend, and you gotta send an ambulance as fast as you can. When the ambulance arrived, to Mark's horror, they were able to keep John alive, and they were able to get him to a hospital where he nearly died twice on the operating table, but he ultimately would make a full recovery. And when John was well enough to speak, he would tell police that Mark is the guy who attacked him, but he had no idea why. When Mark was confronted with these allegations that he was the one who attacked John, he quickly confessed. And the police thought, this is a strange case, but pretty open and shut, and they arrested Mark for attempted murder. When investigators began digging into the motive behind this attack, they, along with Mark, were not prepared for the totally bizarre story that unraveled. The judge in this case would say well-schooled fiction writers could not come up with the plot of this real-life story. And so this crazy story starts 4 months before the stabbing in February of 2003. In February of 2003, Mark was a 16-year-old student who was also a part-time dishwasher at a restaurant near his home in Manchester, England. Mark had okay grades, but even by his own account, he was nowhere near an academic. In fact, he was quite dim-witted. He was very close with his family, who all lived in a very modest home in a very modest neighborhood. By all accounts, Mark was living a very ordinary life. That year, Mark discovered an online chat room for teens in Manchester, England, and it was designed to, make friends and talk about fashion and sports. And initially, when he logged into this chat room, he was just watching. He wasn't really participating. But over time, he became a very active user, and in fact, became totally obsessed with this chat room and basically put everything else in his life on the back burner to the point where his grades were tanking and he was staying up all night. This really took over his life. Also in February of 2013, John was a 14-year-old student who lived in Manchester, England, but not near Mark, and at this point he had not met Mark yet. He was incredibly intelligent and polite and charming, and he was an excellent student, and he went to a very, very prestigious school. But while John's academic life was going really well, his home life was kind of in shambles. His mother had a series of really crappy boyfriends that always left, and they always left her feeling very depressed. And it was just a very sad environment around his mother. And John, unfortunately, had grown up believing one of his mother's ex-boyfriends was his biological father. And even though this boyfriend had abandoned the family, John at least knew who his dad was. But it would turn out his biological father had actually abandoned him when he was a brand new baby, and he had no way of figuring out who his dad even was. John really wanted to escape his home life. He wanted to just live somewhere else, have an adventurous, happy life away from all the sadness and depression he was around all the time. And so it was in that frame of mind that he discovered this chat room, the same one that Mark had discovered. Although they don't know each other yet, they're both entering the same chat room. John's initial interest in this chat room was not nearly as high as Mark's was. Mark pretty much immediately became obsessed with being in this chat room. John was a little bit more reserved, but his mom purchased a laptop for him, which suddenly gave him 24/7 access to this chat room, and he found himself going on there all the time, to the point where he was staying up all night and even skipping meals just so he wouldn't have to leave his screen even for a few minutes. The main focus of this chat room was supposed to be sports and movies and entertainment, but the real reason teenagers were flocking into this particular chat room was to flirt with each other. And Mark and John were no different. They both really enjoyed, these flirtatious interactions they were having with different girls on this chat room. But John's interactions with the girls was very friendly and wasn't going to go anywhere. It was not really intended to. Whereas Mark fell head over heels in love with the girl he was flirting with, and her name was Rachel. Rachel was a 16-year-old living in Manchester, England, who worked at a gym, and when Mark saw her pictures, he was just totally smitten with her, and he sent her a direct message, not really expecting her to write back, but she did, and she seemed at least somewhat interested in him, and that night they stayed up all night chatting with each other, and Mark is just over the moon. For the next couple of days, Mark and Rachel were talking nonstop on this chat room, and then at some point, Rachel says, "Hey, I really want to introduce you to this guy I met on this chat. He reminds me a lot of you. I think you guys would get along great. His name is John." And Mark was like, "Okay, cool." So Rachel introduced him to John, and they hit it off right away, and the three of them formed their own separate chat thread outside of the main chat room. And very quickly, through this separate chat thread that they were on pretty much 24/7, Mark and John would become best friends, and Mark and Rachel would fall deeper and deeper in love with each other. Every time John and Mark were in this chat room, they would use a web camera, but Rachel didn't have one. And initially that really frustrated Mark because he wanted to see his girlfriend in real time, but she said she didn't have the money to get one, and then she said she was shy, and so Mark's getting frustrated, but she says, "Mark, come visit me. You don't live that far away. You can see me in real life in real time." And so initially Mark's excited, and he's talking to John about how excited he is to go see his girlfriend, but then he gets cold feet and he makes an excuse and he doesn't go. Rachel's disappointed, but she asks him again a couple more times if he'll come visit her, and every time he would agree, and then he would kind of chicken out. But after the last time he canceled on her, he finally got the courage up, and he invited her to come visit him. And this is when she started getting cold feet. And they kind of went back and forth until they basically stopped asking to visit each other, and they just decided that their relationship was going to live online, even if there wasn't a web camera involved. About 3 months after Rachel, Mark, and John had started their own separate chat thread, a new user popped up inside the main chat room. It was a fairly controlled group, so it was pretty easy to tell when there were new people added, and this individual only wrote in pink text. So he stood out, his name was Kevin, and he told the group that he was a stalker and that he had a foot fetish. And the group thought this guy was pretty weird, but they figured it was just, some kid trying to get attention. They didn't think much of him. But shortly after Kevin's arrival, Mark would get a private message from Kevin that said, "I know you're Rachel's boyfriend, and I'm her stalker, and I'm gonna hurt her." Mark didn't know what to do, so he just went to Rachel and he said, "Hey, I got this strange email from this guy named Kevin who says he's gonna hurt you and he's your stalker." And Rachel kind of made light of it and said, "Oh, just ignore that guy. I don't know what that's about." And John didn't know what to make about it either, so Mark just kind of ignored it. And then the next day when Mark logged into the chat room, Rachel wasn't there. Now, Rachel always logged in at the same time that Mark did and that John did. It was very rare that she wouldn't be there. And so Mark asked John, "Have you talked to Rachel today?" And John said no. And then Mark went into the main chat room and he asked some people in there if they had seen Rachel or talked to her, and they said no. And that's when Mark went into his email and he had another message from Kevin. This message again was about Rachel, but this time Kevin is saying he actually has Rachel hostage, and the only way he's going to release her is if Mark lets Kevin look at his feet, because again, he has that foot fetish. And so Mark, interestingly, does not go to the police. He doesn't tell anyone about this. He just says, "Okay, I'll do that." And so he lets him see his feet, and then Kevin writes back saying, "Okay, I've released Rachel." Later that day, Rachel came back online and she thanked Mark for what he did, but she felt really bad that he had to be kind of humiliated in that way. And she said, "You know what? We really need to meet up. We need to see each other face to face. I want to apologize to you and give you a hug." And so they decide the next day they're going to meet up finally in town together. But the next day when Mark went to the rendezvous point, Rachel didn't show. In fact, after this missed meeting, Rachel never contacted Mark again. She just vanished. When Mark got back to his computer, he asked John, "Have you talked to Rachel?" And he said no. And again, he went into the main chat room and he asked around, and no one had heard from Rachel. And then a couple of days later, after just continued silence from Rachel, and Mark's really upset about this, he notices a rumor being passed around in the main chat room about how apparently one of the members of this chat room abducted and killed another member of the chat room. And Mark's thinking to himself, no way, that can't be about Rachel. But almost immediately after this rumor was kind of announced on the main chat, people started chiming in that they think it could be Kevin, the guy who writes in all pink, the guy who claims he's a stalker, and this girl Rachel, because they had both logged out around the same time and had not logged back in again. They were the only ones in this chat room that were that inactive. And then after that, dozens more users were commenting that this was actually true, that Kevin had indeed abducted Rachel and killed her. They'd heard about it in other chat rooms and at school, and all of a sudden, Mark's reality is just coming crashing down. And he feels so guilty that he probably could have done something to stop this, and he didn't. But then interestingly, even though Mark was devastated, just crushed by what has happened, he just continued to log into the chat room and acted like nothing had happened. And John picked up on this strange behavior and began kind of delicately asking him, like, are you doing okay? But Mark made it clear he did not want to talk about it. And over time, the rumor about what happened to Rachel and Kevin just kind of left the chat room, and it just seemed like people moved on, including Mark and including John. Over the next month, John and Mark's relationship really strengthened. They continued to speak in that private chat, now missing Rachel, so they were only interacting with each other in there, and they even began meeting up in person and hanging out in real life. About a month after Rachel's disappearance, a new person popped up in the main chat. It was a woman. Her name was Janet, and she wrote in all capitals, and she reached out to Mark. And she said to Mark that she was a mother of two, she was married, she was 44 years old, she was a real estate agent, but secretly, she was a spy for the British Secret Service. And in fact, she was the third most powerful person in all of Britain, and she was contacting Mark because she was sent to recruit him. She told Mark if he agreed to work with her, not only would he become an agent like her, he would become fabulously wealthy, and he could be her boyfriend. Now, of course, to an adult, this sounds preposterous and sounds like an obvious scam. But you gotta remember, Mark at this time was extremely vulnerable. He's just lost his girlfriend under very suspicious circumstances, but no matter how it happened, she's gone and he's still grieving her loss privately. And he's just not a very bright person, so he's kind of primed to be taken advantage of. And she was promising him all the things he wanted in life: status, money, romance. And so even though he didn't necessarily believe everything Janet was saying, he wanted to believe her, and so he went along with it. He did not tell John about his interactions with Janet, perhaps signaling that he didn't fully believe it and was maybe embarrassed to give away details, but we don't know. As soon as Mark told Janet he was prepared to work with her, she made him swear an oath through the chat and then told him he would need to go to London for initiation, where he'd be meeting the Queen, amongst other dignitaries and officials. At this point, Mark asked a couple of qualifying questions, namely, how would I explain to my mom that I was just going to suddenly leave for a couple of days in the middle of the week and miss school? I have to give her a reason for that. And she would say, your mother will be looped in on this process. In fact, once you go to London for initiation, we'll be in touch with her, giving her progress reports on how you're doing, and you'll have 2 opportunities every day to call her. Feeling satisfied that this was in fact legitimate, he told Janet, okay, when do you want me to go? And she said, well, there's a caveat. You have to pass a series of tests before you're going to be allowed to go to initiation. This is where Janet explained to Mark why he specifically was being recruited. She said his friend, John, was actually not named John. His real name was James Bell, and he was a very, very important person, but she couldn't say why until he passed his first test. And so Mark's very confused by this, and he says, okay, well, what's the first test? And she says, well, you need to demonstrate you can protect your friend, James Bell. And so I want you to escort him from his school to his dentist appointment tomorrow. You're going to be his bodyguard for 1 day, but you can't let him know you're his bodyguard. He can't know that you know his real identity. So if you can do that successfully, when you get back, I will explain to you why he is so important. At this point, Mark is very committed to this, so he says, yep, I'll do it. He reaches out to John that day and he says, hey, can we hang out tomorrow? And John tells him, yeah, but I have a dentist appointment right after school, so maybe after that. And Mark says, oh, don't worry, I'll tag along for your dentist appointment. And John's like, great, I could use the company. So the next day, Mark meets up with John, aka James Bell, and he walks with him from his school to his dentist appointment, and he doesn't notice anything suspicious, so he doesn't need to do any bodyguarding duties. And after the dentist appointment, the two of them just go to a mall and they spend the rest of the day together. Once Mark got back to his house and opened his computer, there was a message waiting for him from Janet. And the message said, we had agents following you and you did a great job. You passed your first test. Now I can tell you why James Bell, your friend John, is so very important. And she told him that at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean is this big safe that only a couple of countries know about. And inside of that safe is 568 billion pounds, and it belongs to the Queen. But only one person has access to that safe, and that person is James Bell. Literally, his body would need to be in front of the safe for its special scanner to scan him, recognize it as James Bell, and then it would open its door. Despite its implausibility, Mark believed this was real. Not so much because he naturally believed the safe at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean was real, but it was because he totally believed Janet was real. Janet had the ability to know what he was wearing, where he had gone that day, what he was up to. I mean, she seemed to know everything about him. And it's because she told him she has agents monitoring him all the time, disguised as bus drivers and teachers and mailmen, that basically he was under constant surveillance. And she explained to him that that's what happens when you're being recruited. We have agents watch you. So when Janet gave Mark his final test, despite how shocked Mark was at what he had to do, he was willing to do it because he really believed he was doing it for the government. The test was simple. Mark needed to kill John, aka James Bell. And she explained to him that James Bell actually had an inoperable brain tumor and he was going to die any day. And if the wrong country found out about this, they could steal his body after he died and they could use his body to gain access to this safe. And so we need to preemptively end his life, take control of his body, and get that safe open. She told Mark if he completed this test, he would move on to the initiation phase in London where he would meet the Queen and he would get his first paycheck of £80 million and he would officially become Janet's boyfriend. Mark is in so deep at this point, he is fully committed and he says, yes, I'm prepared to do this. And she says, okay, your new name is Agent 47695 and you need to go buy a large knife. She said there was going to be an abort code for this test, which was going to be 6969, and if at any point he hears anybody say that to him on the day he's supposed to carry out this attack, that means it's off and do not do it. So on June 29, 2003, around 11 a.m., Mark and John, aka Agent 47695 and James Bell, met at a bus station in Manchester. Mark took John down the alleyway that Janet had instructed him to go down to commit the stabbing, and she had assured him she would be one of the first people to arrive on scene. She would be dressed as a detective, and she would ensure he did not get arrested. And so once he was in position, Mark turned around, grabbed John by the shoulder, pulled out his knife, said he loved him, and then began stabbing him. When the police arrived, Janet was not there, and Mark, after giving his statement about what happened, was asking the police officers, when's Janet gonna be here? And no one knew what he was talking about. After John survived the attack and said Mark was the one who attacked him, Mark would tell police, you gotta find Janet. She's the one who can explain what's going on here. But Janet never arrived because Janet didn't exist. Neither did Rachel. Neither did Kevin. Neither did James Bell. Neither did 189 other accounts that Mark interacted with on a daily basis inside of that chat room. And all of those fake accounts were determined to be controlled by one person, and that one person was John. When John was confronted with all these confiscated chat logs that clearly showed he was behind all of these accounts, he confessed. John said he never entered this chat room in order to do any of the things he did or, to manipulate Mark. He said when he joined, he just saw a picture of Mark and was kind of in love with him and wanted to get closer to him but didn't know how. So he created Rachel in order to get closer to Mark, but then became jealous of Mark's love of Rachel. So he killed off Rachel using Kevin, and he didn't expect Mark to believe it. He thought he would pick up that this is all made up when he's involving this stalker that's abducting and killing Rachel. But when he saw Mark totally believed it, John realized, wow, Mark's pretty gullible. I wonder what else I can get him to believe. And before long, he created Janet, who had complete control over Mark. And originally, John was using Janet to make Mark spend more time with John. He was going to be the bodyguard of James Bell, which was really John. When John started to feel guilty about what he was doing to Mark, he realized there was no good way out of this without kind of exposing himself and definitely losing his friendship to Mark, something that in a weird way he really, really cherished. And so he decided that the only way to end this was for him to die. And that's when he had Janet flip the script from protect James Bell to kill James Bell. And even on the day where he was going to get attacked, he had given that abort code. So maybe some part of him thought, I don't necessarily want to go through with this. But he never used the abort code. He was literally prepared to die to protect that relationship with Mark. Mark might have had suspicions that something was up with Janet or even Kevin or Rachel, but he never suspected John was behind any of these accounts. He learned about this betrayal when they were in court, and John is confessing once again to being behind all of these people that Mark had been interacting with. Apparently in court, when Mark is hearing this for the first time, he was just standing there, mouth open, just completely dumbfounded that he's hearing this. And then he would say afterwards, I've been such a fool. Mark was convicted of attempted murder, but he only spent 8 months in jail, and then he was given a 2-month probationary period where during that time, he could only go on the internet with supervision and he wasn't allowed to enter into any chat rooms. John was convicted of inciting his own murder, which no one else has ever been charged with, so this is a first. And he was not given any jail time, but he was given 3 years of probation, where in that time, he was not allowed to use the internet without supervision, and he also was not allowed to enter into any chat rooms. And both boys were told they had a permanent restraining order on the other, so for the rest of their lives, they will never interact. Today's podcast is sponsored by the online therapy platform BetterHelp. Stress can rear its ugly head in all types of ways. Maybe work has you anxious about deadlines, or maybe you're worried that the college fund you've been investing in for years is actually not going to be enough for your kids. And maybe you don't even know you're stressed. In fact, many people don't always recognize the physical symptoms of stress, things like headaches, teeth grinding, and even digestive problems. But nowadays, no one has the time to go to the doctor's office and fill out all that paperwork and then wait around for the doctor to finally come out to help you deal with your stress. But that doesn't mean you need to let your mental health suffer. Now, you can get the professional help you need from the comfort of your own home, and that's with BetterHelp. BetterHelp is customized online therapy that offers video, phone, and even live chat sessions with your therapist, so you don't have to see anyone on camera if you don't want to. It's much more affordable than in-person therapy, and financial aid is available to those who need it. BetterHelp is committed to facilitating great therapeutic matches, making it super easy and free to change therapists if needed. In today's world that's telling you to do more, sleep less, and grind all the time, here's your reminder to take care of yourself, do less, and maybe try some therapy. So give it a try and see if online therapy can help lower your stress. MrBallen listeners can get 10% off their first month at betterhelp.com/MrBallenPod. That's BETTERHELP.com/MrBallenPod. The next and final story of today's episode is called The Old Man's Secret. On August 28, 1984, an 18-year-old girl named Elizabeth went missing. On the first day she was gone, her friends and family went out looking for her, but they couldn't find her. The following day, when she still hadn't shown up and no one had heard from her, her parents went to the local police station in their Austrian town of Amstetten, which is about an hour west of Vienna, and they reported her missing. The police launched an initial search of the town and the surrounding areas, but after several weeks, they had found nothing that connected to Elizabeth and where she might have gone. A month after she had been reported missing, her parents came back to the police station, except this time they were carrying a note they say they received in the mail from their missing daughter. It was postmarked from a town that was about 2 hours west of Amstetten, and in this note, Elizabeth writes directly to her parents, and she tells them that she had grown tired of living with them, and she did not want them to come looking for her, and if she discovered they were looking for her, she would just flee the country. After the police read the note, they asked the parents if they thought it was real, if this was a legitimate letter from their daughter, and they said, yeah, they think it is. And then after that, her father, Joseph, suggested that maybe his daughter had run off to join a cult. That was something he thought she was getting into before her disappearance. After the parents left the police station, the police began conducting interviews with other family members and friends of Elizabeth to see if it was possible that she might have run off to join a cult. And virtually everyone they spoke to said, absolutely not. There is no way she ran off to join a cult. That just wasn't her. She was a quiet, reserved person, and they had never heard her talking about a cult or anything that even resembled a cult. These answers left the police feeling very suspicious of the whole situation, and so they decided to look into the young woman's history to see if there was some other reason she might have run off. In their research, they discovered that Elizabeth was one of 7 siblings that all lived together with their parents, Joseph and Rose Marie. Joseph was a successful electrical engineer and real estate developer who was well liked and respected in town, and Rose Marie had gotten married very young at the age of 17, and she had stayed home to take care of the kids. By all accounts, from the outside looking in, they were a very ordinary family. But as the police began to dig deeper and deeper into their history, they discovered there were some big problems behind closed doors. Despite his friendly, outward public appearance, Joseph was actually a ruthless authoritarian when he was home alone with his family. At night, when he came home from work, his wife and his kids would immediately stop whatever they were doing and go silent in hopes they might avoid a beating. The only member of the family that seemed willing to stand up to Joseph was Elizabeth, and she and her father would frequently get into screaming fights, and then as punishment for these fights, Joseph would not only beat his daughter, he would also prevent her from seeing her friends for long periods of time, and he would go through her personal things like her diary. Their toxic relationship finally came to a head when Elizabeth finally ran away from home 2 years prior to her most recent disappearance. She made it all the way to Vienna before authorities caught up to her and brought her back home. Upon learning about this earlier disappearance, the police became convinced that the most recent disappearance was yet another attempt to escape her abusive and controlling father. And so the police decided that this was more of a family affair, and they didn't push the investigation further. A year went by, and neither the police nor her family heard anything from Elizabeth, and so her case was closed. But 24 years later, a seemingly unconnected event broke her case wide open. On April 19, 2008, a 19-year-old named Kirsten was rushed to the hospital in Amstetten. Her skin was so pale it looked almost transparent. She was unconscious and suffering from seizures as well as lung and kidney failure. The doctors were able to stabilize her by putting her into a medically induced coma, but after running a litany of tests, they couldn't figure out what was causing her to have this medical condition, and so they were not able to treat her effectively. They assumed it had to be some sort of genetic condition, so they put her name into the medical database, but nothing came up. Her name wasn't listed. And so this was very perplexing because everybody's name was in this database. And so they took her name and they ran it in other medical databases, and her name didn't show up in any of them. And so totally confused by this girl who seemingly didn't exist, who was exhibiting symptoms of a condition none of the doctors had seen before, the doctors decide they have to speak to the guy she showed up with, an older man who was out in the waiting room. When the doctors approached him, he said he was Kirsten's grandfather, but beyond that, he offered virtually no new information. In fact, he was aggressive and rude and dismissive, and anytime they asked him questions, he would answer as minimally as possible. And when the doctors really fixated on whether or not Kirsten had some underlying medical condition, he would not give them an answer. He would just dismiss it and say he didn't know anything, but it was the doctor's impression that he did know something, he just didn't want to tell them. And this behavior shocked them because they're thinking the information he has could potentially save his granddaughter's life. Why wouldn't he want to give it to us? And so after this disastrous interaction with the grandfather, the doctors decide to get the police involved. There were just too many red flags not to. When the police arrived, they were surprised to find out that this older man in the waiting room was none other than Joseph, the father of the still missing girl, Elizabeth. The police asked Joseph, "What's going on here?" And he tells them that earlier that day, he had opened his front door of his house, and lying on his front step was a girl he had never seen before. It was Kirsten, and there was a note laying on her from his missing daughter, Elizabeth. In the note, Elizabeth writes to Joseph directly and tells him, "This girl here is Kirsten, and she is my daughter, so she's your granddaughter, and she's sick and I can't take care of her. Can you and mom take her to the hospital?" While the police had many more questions about this totally bizarre turn of events, they realized that for the time being, they needed to focus their efforts on just getting Elizabeth to contact them, because they needed to know more about Kirsten's medical condition so they could save her life. And so the police went to the media and they put out a message on TV and on radio that was a direct appeal to Elizabeth that basically said, "We need you to come forward as soon as possible and speak to us so we can help save your daughter's life." And all the messages worked, because a week later, Elizabeth, along with her father Joseph, showed up at the hospital where Kirsten was staying. When doctors asked, Joseph did not get into detail about how he actually located Elizabeth. He simply said he found her and now she wants to see her daughter. The doctors noticed that Elizabeth, who was supposed to be in her early 40s, looked like she could easily be in her 60s. Her hair was completely white and her skin was so pale it was almost transparent, just like they had noticed about her daughter's skin. And so after they checked in, Joseph and Elizabeth made their way to Kirsten's room, and the pair went inside, and the doctors that were in there would say that Elizabeth looked terrified. She was hunched over and kind of slouched down, and she wouldn't make eye contact with any of the doctors. And as she was standing there looking at her terribly sick daughter, the doctors began asking her, "Do you know of any underlying health problems your daughter might have that might help us treat her more effectively?" And Elizabeth was so scared she couldn't even talk. And at some point, the questions became too much for her, and she just turned around and walked out into the hall with Joseph. And once they got out into the hall, the police were waiting for them. They had been tipped off as soon as the doctors saw Joseph and Elizabeth come into the hospital. Elizabeth and Joseph were detained and brought to the police station, where they were put in two separate rooms to be interviewed. They first interviewed Elizabeth. And initially, just like in the hospital room, she was totally mute and didn't say anything. And for 5 hours, the police grilled her with questions. Where had she been for the last 24 years? What happened to Kirsten? Did she have something to do with her illness? And they kept reminding her throughout these 5 hours that if she never gave them any information, and God forbid something were to happen to Kirsten, she, Elizabeth, could be held criminally liable. And so eventually Elizabeth, in a very small, meek voice, said, "Okay, I'll tell you the story, but you have to promise me I never have to see my father, Joseph, ever again." When she said this to the police, they could tell she was so scared that they said, "Okay, fine. You never have to see your father again. We'll make sure of it. Now tell us what happened." After that, Elizabeth clutched her hands, she took a deep breath, and then she told them one of the most horrifying stories they had ever heard. A story so disturbing that it would make headlines all around the world for months. It all began 24 years earlier on August 28, 1984, the day Elizabeth went missing. On that day, she told police she was at her family home in Amstetten when her father asked her to come into the basement to help him with something. Her father, for the last several years, had been constructing a bomb shelter in their basement, and he was now only one door installation away from being done. At the time, in the early 1980s, the Cold War was still very much on, and so building bomb shelters inside of your home was a relatively common thing. So Elizabeth goes down into her basement and she sees her father standing in front of this empty frame where this door is going to go that leads into the shelter. And so she walks over and steps through the frame into the shelter. She turns around and her father hands her this door and she holds it in the middle of the frame while he secures it to the hinges. And then once it's securely in place, suddenly he swings open the door, knocking Elizabeth backwards farther into the shelter. And before she could stand back up again, her father had run inside and pushed an ether-soaked towel onto her face, knocking her unconscious. When she came to again, she found herself chained up in the very back room of the shelter. It would turn out this bomb shelter that Joseph had spent 6 years constructing was not actually a bomb shelter. It was a prison he was building specifically for Elizabeth. To get into this shelter, you would have to go down the steps into the basement, which looked like a typical unfinished basement. And then on the far wall, you would see these shelves that had things like paint cans and screwdrivers and other tools you would expect to find in a basement. But if you walked over to the left side of the shelving, there was a lock on the back of it that if you undid it, the shelf itself would swing out like a door, and then behind it on the wall would reveal a 3-foot tall secret door. This secret door was also locked, but not by a key lock. Instead, it was locked by a keypad lock that only Joseph had the code to. And since Joseph was an electrical engineer, he took great care in ensuring this lock never could be tampered with or destroyed. That thing was going to stay locked unless he unlocked it. When Joseph entered his code into the keypad, he could open that secret door and it would reveal this secret underground prison that was basically a winding maze of small rooms with ceilings that were too short to be able to stand up all the way in. If you walked through this secret door and actually entered into this prison, you would start by entering this soundproof narrow hallway that went on for several feet before it entered into this very small bathroom area where the bathroom was unbelievably cramped and there was no doors, there was no privacy. And then if you didn't stop in the bathroom and you just kept walking straight through that first hallway, you would reach another hallway that was totally soundproof and narrow. And at the end of that hallway, it would feed into a very small bedroom that was so small that it barely contained the one bed that was inside of it. And then off to the right side of that bedroom was another door that led into a similarly sized bedroom. All of the walls of this underground prison were made of thick reinforced concrete. That, combined with the soundproofing that Joseph had installed throughout the entire prison, meant no one could hear Elizabeth's cries for help. Also, the inside of the prison was heavily monitored by Joseph's security system. So truly, Elizabeth had absolutely no privacy. She was completely trapped, and the only way she was getting out was if her father freed her. For the first 5 years of her imprisonment, she remained in that dungeon all alone. Her only connection to the outside world was her father, who would come down almost every night to drop off basic supplies and to assault her. As far as Joseph's wife and his other kids knew, he was just spending all this time in the basement because that's where he worked when he was not at the office. In 1988, Elizabeth became pregnant with her father's child. She was terrified of the pregnancy and begged Joseph to at least allow her to deliver the child in a hospital. But he refused. He wasn't willing to potentially expose himself for what he was doing. And so he gave her a book about childbirth, and he gave her a pair of scissors to cut the umbilical cord, and he said, "Good luck." And so on August 30th, Elizabeth delivered her daughter, Kirsten, alone in that basement. Following the birth of Kirsten, Elizabeth would deliver 6 more of her father's children, all the same way she delivered Kirsten, alone and in the basement. In 1996, one of Elizabeth's newborn babies, Michael, was born with respiratory issues, and so Elizabeth pleaded with Joseph to take the baby to the hospital to get help, but Joseph refused. He was worried he would be exposed. And so 3 days after his birth, the baby died in Elizabeth's arms. And after the baby died, Joseph just took the body, threw it in a stove, and incinerated it like it was nothing. In the late 90s, the 6 living children down in the basement were getting bigger and noisier, and so Joseph came up with a plan in order to reduce the chances of them being discovered. And so one day, Joseph went downstairs into the basement and he took one of Elizabeth's youngest children away from her. And then he threatened her and the rest of the kids down there that if they tried to fight back or if they ever tried to escape, he would seal off the basement and he would gas them to death. Previously, Joseph had punished the entire family by turning off their power and cutting off their food and water supply for multiple days at a time, so they knew he was willing and able to hurt them if he wanted to. And so when he took this young child away from Elizabeth, they didn't put up a fight and the baby disappeared upstairs. And when Joseph's wife, Rosemary, came home, he put on this elaborate charade about how he had discovered this baby on the front step and that there was a note attached to the baby and it was from Elizabeth, their missing daughter, and this child was apparently Elizabeth's and she couldn't take care of it and she was leaving it here for he and Rosemary to raise it as their own. And Joseph had actually made Elizabeth write out this note and sign it to add credibility to the story. And so when Elizabeth's mother, Rosemary, saw this note and heard Joseph's story, she believed it. Over the next several years, Joseph would steal 2 more of Elizabeth's young children and then stage having found them on his front step with a note from Elizabeth. And with each discovered child, Rosemary amazingly never asked any questions. She just took these kids in and she and Joseph raised them as their own. Eventually, when these 3 kids got old enough, Joseph would tell them that their real mother, Elizabeth, was a lowlife and she had abandoned them and she didn't care about them, when in reality, their mother and their other 3 siblings they didn't know existed were locked up in the basement below their feet. Initially, investigators believed all of these children Joseph had with Elizabeth were all mistakes, but it would turn out that was not the case. Joseph would admit that the reason he initially imprisoned Elizabeth was because he wanted to completely control her. He wanted to own her. And so he decided that if he could just impregnate her as many times as possible and make her have all these kids, even if she eventually got out of the prison, no man would want her. She had too many kids, and so she would remain his property. And so over the entire time Elizabeth was imprisoned, over 2 decades, the nightly assaults by her father never slowed down. They happened thousands of times. But despite the horrific and tragic circumstances surrounding each of her children's births, she loved her children unconditionally and would spend all of her time doing her best to educate them and care for them. The 3 children that remained with her, that were not taken by Joseph, she taught them how to read and how to write. And when Joseph had given them a TV and a radio to keep down there, she would use those 2 items to try to teach her kids about the outside world, and she would promise them that someday they would get to experience it for real. Finally, in 2008, so 24 years after Elizabeth had originally been captured by her father, her oldest daughter, Kirsten, becomes extremely sick, and Elizabeth convinces Joseph to bring her to the hospital. And 1 week later, Joseph's heinous crimes were revealed to the world. Once police found out about the secret prison, they rushed to the house and they went downstairs and they used the codes and instructions that Joseph had given them, and they went inside and they freed the last 2 remaining children that were still there. When they brought them to the hospital, the youngest of these 2 kids, who was 5 years old, he didn't speak the entire time. He just pressed his face up against the glass of the car window and he stared out in utter amazement because to that point in his life, he had never actually seen the world. After those 2 kids were brought to the hospital, they were reunited with the other 3 siblings that had been taken away from them years ago to live upstairs with Joseph and Rosemary. And apparently the reunion was very emotional and the kids were extremely happy to see each other. And then a couple days later, Kirsten would come out of her coma and she too would have a chance to be reunited with all of her siblings. Kirsten would ultimately make a full recovery. It would turn out she was suffering from a severe vitamin D deficiency. And vitamin D you primarily get from the sun, and in her 19 years of life, she had never been in the sun. As soon as the story broke about this family being trapped inside of this basement, everybody had the same question. How could Elizabeth's mother, Rosemary, not know what was going on in her basement? But the police had the same suspicions about Rosemarie, and they investigated her and they ruled her out. And they said she's not at fault here, she's a victim too. She had been so badly abused by Joseph that she lived in fear of him. And so when he forbade her from ever going anywhere near the basement, she listened. And if she ever heard any strange sounds coming out of the basement, or if she ever suspected any strange behavior by Joseph, she kept those thoughts to herself because she was scared. It's also worth noting that in those 24 years that Elizabeth and her kids were trapped in the basement, Joseph had over 100 people rent out a room inside of his house that was right over the basement. And in those 24 years, not one of those tenants ever said Joseph was acting strangely or complained about strange noises coming from the basement. However, one tenant who was there for a 4-year stretch had a dog with him the whole time, and every night the dog at some point would suddenly stand up, its ears would prick up, and it would start growling like it heard or it saw something. And at first, this tenant would try to see what the dog had seen or heard, but after never seeing anything, he would always just dismiss the dog when it did this at night. Later on, when that tenant figured out what was actually happening inside the house while he was there, he realized his dog was most likely hearing the faint sounds of the family that was imprisoned right below him. After a year of therapy and rehabilitation, Elizabeth and her 6 kids were given new identities by the Austrian government, and they were sent off to a secret location to start their lives over. As such, there's virtually no information about how they're doing today. However, anonymous sources have come forward and said the family has successfully reintegrated into society, and they are all leading relatively normal and happy lives. As for Joseph, he was quickly given a life sentence, and today he is one of the most hated people in his prison due to the nature of his crimes. He is so hated that in 2016, when he was out in general population, he was attacked by other inmates and had several of his teeth knocked out. And so now prison officials are worried if they leave him in general population, he'll be killed, and so he spends virtually all of his time in solitary confinement. He will be eligible for parole in 2024 when he is 89 years old. In 1985, 36-year-old Michael Reamer was a roofer in Tacoma, Washington, and his boss described him as being a work hard, play hard type of guy. In the winter months, when there really wasn't any roofing to be done, Mike would supplement his income by trapping coyote, mink, and muskrat in the forest that butted up against the Nisqually River, which was an 80-mile stretch that ran right near his home. Most of the traps Mike would set would be far away from any actual trail, because wherever there was a trail, you would have human foot traffic, and that would scare away the animals that you're trying to catch in your trap. And so as a result, he would place his traps in very remote, isolated sections of the forest, which meant he needed to know where those sections were. And so over the 15 years he spent trapping in this forest, he got really, really good at navigating it. It was like he had a map in his head of where everything was in this forest. Plus, Mike was already an avid outdoorsman, and so navigating a forest and being out in the wild was something that just kind of came naturally to him. Mike's girlfriend was a 21-year-old woman named Diana Robertson, and they had a 2-year-old daughter named Crystal. Mike and Diana had a rocky relationship, to say the least. In fact, in October of that year, Diana had filed a restraining order against Mike after he had kicked in the door and thrown her to the ground. Mike also always carried a gun on him, and he had a very quick temper. But despite their significant relationship issues, the one thing they could always see eye to eye on was their daughter, Crystal. They adored her, and when it came to decisions about her, they were always on the same page. It was whatever is in the best interest of Crystal. In December of that year, Diana and Mike were able to reconcile, and so Diana threw the restraining order out. And in fact, she and Crystal moved back in with Mike, which made Crystal very, very happy. Just a couple of days after moving back in, they decided they wanted to go out and go camping together as a family, and then also pick out a real Christmas tree they could bring back for the holidays. And so they settled on an area that was going to be in the same forest where Mike had all of his traps set, and they figured they could, get their family time in, they could get their Christmas tree, and Mike would be able to check his traps, saving himself from making another trip later on. So on December 12th, the 3 of them loaded up into Mike's red pickup truck, and they drove the 30 minutes down towards Nisqually River, where there was this logging road that Mike would use to park his truck and then walk in to check his traps. So Mike pulls over on the side of the road, they all hop out, and Mike leads the way right into the middle of the woods. There's no trail. Mike is just bringing them to an area where 1, his traps will be, and 2, he thinks is suitable for camping and for looking for a Christmas tree. Later that afternoon, Crystal was spotted walking around a parking lot of a Kmart 20 miles away from where Mike had parked the car near Nisqually River. and she's just walking around. She looks totally confused. She's all alone, and the employees of the Kmart are looking out, and they see this girl, and they're all watching, waiting for, her parents or a guardian or someone to walk over and show that they are with this girl. But after a couple of minutes, when no one does that, one of the employees goes out and tries to talk to her. And this employee would say when she talked to the girl, she kept looking over her shoulder and she was just terrified the whole time. And so this employee asked her, what's your name? And she didn't say anything. She asked her, where are you coming from? Where are your parents? Who's looking after you? And to all the questions she was asked, she didn't say anything. She just looked terrified and was looking over her shoulder. And so this employee brings the girl back inside and they call the police. And so the police show up and they ask the girl the same questions that the employees have been asking her, and the girl's still not speaking. And so after they made an announcement inside to say, hey, is anybody in here the parent or guardian of this child? And no one came forward. They said, okay, well, we have no other choice, but we're gonna have to move her to temporary foster care. And so they move her to a foster home, and then they put an ad out in the newspaper that day with a picture of her, basically saying, if you know me, contact this number. 2 days later, Crystal's maternal grandmother would see the picture in the newspaper, and the ad did not have a description of, how she was discovered. It just said she had been found at this particular Kmart, and if you know who she is, please contact this number. Even without the details, the grandmother knows something has gone wrong, because there's no reason in the world those two parents would abandon their beloved Crystal. And so she calls Diana, she calls Mike, they don't pick up the phone. That's when she calls the number and she says, what's going on? I'm her grandmother, where is she? The police tell her to go to the foster home and they will meet her there and they're going to talk about what happened. So the grandmother flies to the foster home and she arrives there before the police. She goes inside and Crystal is so happy to see her. It's the first time Crystal has really broken out of that kind of catatonic state she had been in ever since she was found at the Kmart. So she runs up to her grandmother, they have this reunion, and the grandmother's so happy to see Crystal, but she's also thinking, where are your parents? Where are Diana and Mike? And so she asks Crystal, where are they, honey? Where is your mom? Where's your dad? And Crystal would speak to her grandmother and she would say, Mommy's in the trees. Her grandmother didn't know what this meant, and so she tried to ask clarifying questions, but Crystal was not very verbal. She was not able to articulate more than what she was saying, so she just kept repeating it, saying, Mommy's in the trees, Mommy's in the trees. And so then the police show up, and the grandmother turns to them and she says, where are her parents? Where are Mike and Diana? And the police turn to her and they're like, we don't know. We found her abandoned in this parking lot and she wasn't speaking and no one knew anything about her. And so until right now, we didn't even know her parents' names. Do you have any idea where they might be? And the grandmother's like, I have no idea. I mean, I'm just learning about all of this stuff now. But when I came over here, Crystal said to me, Mommy's in the trees. And she's not very verbal, so she can't explain much more than that. But she just kept saying, Mommy's in the trees. And I know Mike liked to go camping in this one area near the Nisqually River. He keeps traps out near the edge of the water. He catches some small animals out there. So I know he goes out there and goes camping. And so maybe that's what Crystal's referencing, that they were in the trees. So they were in that forest over there. The grandmother also gave the police the address to Mike's house, and the police used that information to launch their search for the parents. And so the first place they go is Mike's house, and all the lights are off, the door is locked, and his red pickup truck, because the grandmother said he drove a red pickup truck, his red pickup truck is not there. And so they rule out his house, they're not there, and they begin flying a plane not only over Tacoma, which is the area where they were living, but also over that forest that was right up against the Nisqually River. And as they're flying, they're looking for campsites that could potentially be Mike and Diana, but they're also looking for the red pickup truck, which is fairly distinctive. And after a couple of days of flying all over the forest and looking around the side streets and putting people in the forest walking on foot, they couldn't find anything and they turned the search off. And they would tell the grandmother and the rest of the family on Diana's and Mike's side that they really just needed to wait for more information to come in because they couldn't just spend an indefinite amount of time scanning a fairly large area. They have all of Tacoma and this huge forest. And so everyone just had to wait. 2 months later, a man and his dog were out walking on this logging road that was about 10 miles away from the Nisqually River and 30 miles away from the Kmart where Crystal was found. And they're walking on this road and they see way off in the distance, there's this truck that's pulled over to the side of this road. And even from a distance, they can tell it's covered in snow. But it hasn't snowed recently. There's snow on the ground, but the amount of snow that is on this truck indicates it's been sitting here for quite a while. And so as they get closer to the truck, this man is looking around, seeing if maybe the owner is nearby, even though it seemed unlikely given the fact that it looks like it's been sitting here a while. And so after he stands there for a minute looking around, feeling pretty confident there's no one in the area, he brushes the snow off the passenger side window and he looks inside, and he doesn't see anything at first, but he notices on the passenger front seat, there's a significant amount of blood on the seat, or what appears to be blood. And this startles the guy, so he backs up from it, and he and his dog very quickly leave this area because they're in this kind of desolate, logging road. He's pretty isolated. And so he gets out of there as quickly as he can, and when he gets to a phone, he calls the police. Police show up and they brush the rest of the snow off, and they find it is a red pickup truck. It's Mike's red pickup truck. Mike and Diana's case had been very big news in the area when it happened, and the news had really not gone away. People were out there looking for this couple. And so as soon as they saw this was Mike's truck, they start fanning out and searching the area, seeing if they can find any other clues about what happened to Mike and Diana. And very quickly, they discovered Diana's body. She was located not far from the red truck, just barely off the road in the forest. She was under several inches of snow, and she had been stabbed 17 times, and there was a tube sock wrapped around her neck. There was no sign of Mike, but once they got inside the truck, there was a manila folder that had been tucked up on the dashboard that just said, "I love you, Diana." When police showed that message to Diana's family, they all said, "That looks like Mike's handwriting. He used to send us handwritten Christmas cards, and that looks exactly the way he writes." As for the blood that was on the passenger seat inside the truck, it had been sitting out for too long, so they weren't able to determine whose blood it was, but they were able to determine it was human. So between the blood on the front seat, the note that was left on the dashboard, the personal furious nature of the way in which Diana was killed, combined with Mike's history of violence and his disappearance, because he's not here anymore, that all made it seem an awful lot like Mike was the guy that did this. In fact, this made for a very tidy ending to a mystery that had actually started before Diana had been killed. On August 10th, 1985, so 4 months before Mike, Diana, and Crystal ventured off into the woods near Nisqually River, 27-year-old Stephen Harkins and his girlfriend, 42-year-old Ruth Cooper, were going camping near Nisqually River in the same forest. They were actually about 15 miles from where Diana's body was ultimately found, and they were very close to a number of Mike's traps, although they probably didn't realize they were near them. During their trip, an unknown assailant walked up to their campsite in the middle of the night and shot them both to death. Stephen was found right away, and he was found inside of his sleeping bag at their campsite, indicating he had been killed in his sleep. Ruth wasn't found for months, and when she was found 1.5 miles away from the campsite, and she had a tube sock tied around her neck, the same way Diana had. And the knot that was used on the tube sock was even the same as the knot used on Diana's tube sock. So the similarity was just too much to overlook. And so to the police, they're thinking, Mike has to be the guy in both of these cases. He attacked Ruth and Stephen, perhaps because they were, on his territory where his traps were, and he didn't like that. He has a history of violence, and so he attacks them. And then a couple months later, he attacks Diana, and then he flees. As for his daughter being found alive at the Kmart, it would seem he just did not have it in him to harm his own child, and so he dropped her off at the Kmart before he ultimately fled. Despite everything seeming to fit just perfectly to where, yep, Mike is definitely the guy, not only for Diana, but for Ruth and for Stephen, we figured it out. Despite that being the overwhelming feeling, there were a couple of questions that remained unanswered, like the FBI. They were unable to confirm the handwriting on that folder that said, "I love you, Diana." They were unable to confirm that that in fact was Mike's handwriting. Diana's family was really convinced it was his, but the FBI said it's not necessarily a match. And then you have the motives for the two crimes. We can understand one of them. Him attacking Diana, unfortunately, people attack their partners all the time, and so we can understand that, we can rationalize that. But for him to attack Ruth and Stephen, two total strangers, because what, they encroached on your land, even though it's not your land, it's public land, and you just happen to put your traps out there, that didn't seem like a strong enough reason for him to want to kill them. But the circumstantial evidence was overwhelmingly pointing at Mike being the guy. You have the fact that he's this violent guy with a history of domestic abuse. He knows this area well where both crimes were committed. You have the tube sock tied around Diana the same way it's tied around Ruth. It just had to be Mike. And so because the police felt so strongly it had to be Mike, they were willing to overlook these lingering questions. And so the police wanted to issue an arrest warrant for Mike, but they needed to be able to prove he was alive, because if he was dead, then that calls into question his ability to have committed these two crimes. And so they didn't have proof he was alive. And so very quickly, this story faded out of the headlines because basically everybody believed Mike had done it and he had run off somewhere, and maybe someday we'll figure out where he went and we'll bring him to justice. But until then, we know he's the guy. For years, no one heard from Mike, no one saw Mike. It was like he had just totally vanished. Crystal was raised by relatives, and many of the detectives that were working on these cases eventually retired or moved on. Then, 25 years later, in March of 2011, a hiker was walking through the forest near the Nisqually River, about 1 mile from where Diana's body was found, and they would stumble upon a piece of a human skull. She calls the police show up, they search the area, and they discover another bone, a human jawbone. And it would turn out it was Mike's. The rest of Mike's remains were never found, and because there was so little of him to work with, police were not able to determine a cause of death. However, they were able to date his death back to almost exactly the same time frame that Diana had died. Additionally, investigators believe the reason they did not find more of Mike's remains is because he had been buried. The two bones that were found, the skull and the jawbone, they were located within 1 mile of where Diana's body had been found, and that area, after Diana had been found, had been scoured. They looked everywhere for clues, and because he apparently died at the same time she did, he would have been out there and they would have found him. So the fact that they didn't find him can only mean he was underground. So this all meant Mike could not have been the killer, because in order for him to have been the killer, he not only would have had to attack Diana and then drive his daughter to the Kmart and then drive back to the forest, he would then need to take his own life and then also somehow bury himself. Some of the police officers that had worked that case were still on the police force, and so when they heard this news about Mike not being the killer, they were like, it never really made any sense that he would attack Ruth or Steven, unless he was a serial killer. And then it clicked. They probably were dealing with a serial killer. It just wasn't Mike. And their only eyewitness was the toddler, Crystal, who apparently the serial killer could not bring themselves to harm. And so as a result, Crystal just sat there and watched these horrible things happen to her parents, and then probably spent a fair amount of time with the serial killer afterwards because they needed to drive her to the Kmart. Investigators and her family had tried to get her to give more information about what she had witnessed, but all she could say was, "Mommy's in the trees." And so there are really only two interpretations of what that means. Either one, she was just stating that her mother was in the forest, and that would have been accurate, or she's remembering her mother trying to escape a serial killer by climbing up into a tree. Or maybe even that she was in the tree with her mother as they both were trying to escape a serial killer with a knife. So when the police have this revelation that Mike was not the killer, that in fact it was probably a serial killer, and we know nothing about this serial killer besides what Crystal had to say as a toddler, and that didn't provide any sort of real clarity on who this person was or what their MO was, they went back and looked at all the unsolved murders in the Pacific Northwest, specifically around this forest. They discovered that in addition to Mike and Diana and Ruth and Steven, there were 4 other sets of couples that were killed in and around this forest, and all of them bared striking resemblances to one another. The most recent attack that is associated with the tube sock killer occurred in 2006, but the reality is police don't really know anything about the tube sock killer. All they know is that they're probably in the Pacific Northwest, and they are definitely still at large. Today, the next and final story of today's episode is called Where Did He Go? In mid-August 2013, Mike and Karen Laspisa helped their beloved only child, 19-year-old Bryce Laspisa, get all of his things packed up and into the family car. Bryce had just spent the summer with his parents in their home in Laguna Niguel, California, which is one of the nicest places to live in the entire country. But now that the summer was coming to an end, it was time for Bryce to head back to Sierra College in Rocklin, California, where he was set to start his sophomore year. Once all of his things were packed inside the trunk of the car, all 3 of them hopped inside and then made the 7-hour drive north to his campus. Once his parents had moved him into his apartment, they gave him a hug and a kiss and wished him luck, and then they left. On their ride back home, Mike and Karen talked about how well their son seemed to be doing. He loved his school, he loved the program he was in graphic design, he was a very gifted artist. He had lots of friends, he had a wonderful girlfriend. It just seemed like he was living his best life and he was on the path to success. So nothing could prepare them for what their son did 2 weeks later. Just a couple of days after getting dropped off at school, Bryce's very close friend and roommate, Sean, and Bryce's girlfriend, Kim, noticed Bryce was acting erratically. Specifically, he was drinking a ton of hard alcohol. Now, Bryce was no saint. He liked to drink and party like many other kids his age did, but the amount of alcohol he was consuming was concerning. Also, Bryce began experimenting with a drug called Vyvanse, which is a very powerful stimulant that's normally used to treat attention deficit disorder. Now, Bryce didn't have attention deficit disorder. He was taking it in order to stay up late at night and play video games. But between the heavy drinking and the drug use, it seemed like Bryce's personality was starting to change. He was becoming anxious and skittish and kind of paranoid. And so finally, Sean and Kim confronted him about his substance abuse and asked him, what's going on? What's causing you to act this way? And Bryce would say, nothing, guys, I'm fine. I'm just, drinking and doing whatever I want to do. It's not a big deal. But Sean and Kim, they weren't buying it. They were convinced that something bad had happened to Bryce, and the way he was coping with it was by drinking really heavily and taking this drug. On August 28th, so about 2 weeks after Bryce has been dropped back off at school by his parents, Bryce and his roommate Sean were alone in their apartment together. And at some point, as they're sitting there just kind of minding their own business, Bryce says to Sean, hey, I want to give you something. And he takes his diamond earrings out and he gives them to Sean. And Sean's looking at these earrings and he's like, didn't your mom give these to you? Aren't these important to you? These are expensive. And Bryce just says, no, I want you to have them. And so Sean is looking at these earrings, looking back at Bryce, wondering what's going on here. And then before he can even refuse the gift, Bryce is grabbing his Xbox and putting it on the table and telling Sean, I want you to have this too. Take my Xbox. And so Sean is like, I can't accept these two things. These are expensive. These are valuable to you. What's going on here? But Bryce would just say, look, man, I want you to have these things. You're important to me and I want to give these to you. And so as Sean is sitting there wondering how to handle this very strange offering, he watched Bryce pull his phone out and begin really aggressively texting somebody. And then after a while, Bryce looks up from his phone and he tells Sean, hey, just so you know, I broke up with Kim. At this point, Sean knows, okay, something is definitely wrong here. There's no reason Bryce would break up with Kim. They were such a loving couple. They doted on each other. They were very close. They had just seen each other earlier in the day. Nothing seemed to be wrong. And so now Bryce is text breaking up with her. It didn't make any sense. Plus, Bryce is now trying to give him all these valuable things. It just wasn't really adding up. And so Sean decided he needed to get in touch with Bryce's parents because clearly someone needed to intervene. And so Sean waited until Bryce left. Bryce actually left to go talk to Kim. And at that point, Sean got his phone out and he looked up Bryce's parents and he called them. Bryce's mother, Karen, she picks up the phone and Sean explains that, your son, he's acting strangely, he's abusing drugs and alcohol, and I wouldn't be doing this unless I thought there was a problem. Like, I'm not trying to get him in trouble. I want you to reach out to him and see what's going on because I think there's a problem. And so Karen was alarmed by this. She had no idea any of this was going on. And she says, okay, I'll reach out to my son. Thank you for telling me. And so they hang up. And before Karen can even call Bryce, Bryce is calling her. And so Karen answers the phone, but it's not Bryce. It's Kim, his now ex-girlfriend. And she says to Karen, hey, I'm sorry to just call you like this, but your son, he just showed up at my apartment and he's acting so strangely that I actually took his keys. I don't want him to drive. There's something wrong with him. It's hard to describe, but he just seems totally off. And so now Karen's really concerned because just seconds ago, Sean has told her basically the same thing. And so Karen asks Kim, will you please put my son on the phone? Bryce picks up the phone and he says, hey, mom, and he sounds totally normal. And she asks him, what's going on? I keep hearing that you're acting strangely and, what are you doing over at Kim's apartment? What's going on here? And Bryce would tell his mom that, look, mom, I just broke up with Kim. It's a very messy breakup. That's why she's calling you. She's upset. And, that's why I'm over here. We're talking about it. And look, at this point, I just really want to go home. I want to go back to my apartment, but she has my keys. Can you please tell her to give me my car keys back so I can leave? But Karen wasn't really buying it. She knew her son really well, and it just seemed totally strange that two of his very close friends in his inner circle would say the same thing, independent of one another. And so she says, you know what, Bryce, look, I want you to just stay there, and I'm going to fly out there first thing tomorrow morning, and I'm going to just see what's going on out there. And at this, Bryce immediately says, no, mom, I have a lot to talk to you about, and until I talk to you about it, I don't want you coming out here. And so Karen's like, what do you mean you have a lot to talk to me about? What is it that you have to talk to me about? I don't really understand. But Bryce refused to elaborate over the phone, which Karen thought was very odd because Bryce was remarkably forthcoming with his parents. They had a very open relationship. They were very honest with each other. So for him to not even give a hint at whatever it was that was on his mind that in some way had to do with what was going on here, it just seemed very odd and unnecessarily cryptic. And so Karen gave up trying to get more information out of her son, and instead, she put her husband on the phone. And he asked Bryce, hey, what's going on here? Are you okay? And your mom tells me there's some problem, like, what's going on here? And Bryce again just reiterates, look, Dad, I just broke up with my girlfriend. That's all that's going on here. There's no need to be concerned. I just need one of you to tell Kim to give me my keys back so I can go back to my apartment. That's all I need right now. And so Mike felt convinced that his son was totally fine, even though it did seem odd that two of his friends had said he was acting erratically. But from Mike's perspective, Bryce seemed just fine. And so he said as much to Karen and thought, let's just get Kim to give him his keys back and he can go back to his apartment and we can talk to him later about whatever it is that's going on. And so reluctantly, Karen gets back on the phone and she asks to speak with Kim. And she says, hey, Kim, would you mind giving our son his keys back? He'd like to leave. And so Kim says, okay, I'll give him his keys. And then they hung up. And then Kim got the keys out. She gave them to Bryce and Bryce left. At about 11:30 p.m. that night, Bryce was in his car. He was getting ready to leave when his mom called him back and said, okay, look, I want you to go home, but as soon as you get there, just give me a call so I know you're safe. And Bryce said, no problem, I'll give you a call. About an hour and a half later at 1 a.m., Bryce called his mom back to let her know that he was home safe at his apartment, and Karen and Mike are totally relieved, and they tell their son, okay, we'll talk to you tomorrow morning. 10 hours later at 11 a.m. on August 29th, Karen received an automated phone call from her car insurance company letting her know that roadside assistance had been used on their 2003 Toyota Highlander car. That was Bryce's car. And so Karen's totally confused because the last she spoke to her son, he was at his apartment. He was home safe. He did not have any car problems. And so she's thinking, did he get up early this morning and get into an accident and call roadside assistance? Or maybe last night he got into car problems and just didn't tell her about it, but they were minor. And so she calls Bryce, but Bryce doesn't pick up. And so she dials his roommate, Sean. Sean does answer the phone, and she says, hey, would you mind putting Bryce on the line? But Sean says, Bryce isn't here, and he didn't come home last night. Considering the general weirdness around their son's recent behavior, this really shocked Karen and Mike. At first, they thought we need to call the police because something horrible has happened. But then they thought, well, wait a minute, let's go into his bank statements because he has a credit card that we gave him. And let's see if there's any recent purchases that will allow us to track where he is. And so they pull up his bank statements, and his most recent charge was only a few hours earlier, and it was at a car repair shop in Buttonwillow, California, which is this small desert town right off of the I-5 highway, located about halfway between his school campus and their hometown in Laguna Niguel. And so Karen and Mike assume their son last night must not have gone to his apartment, but instead just kept on driving south in an attempt to drive all the way back home to his hometown of Laguna Niguel. I mean, after all, he did tell his mom he had a lot to talk about, and he didn't want to talk about it on the phone, and so they assumed he must be driving here to talk about whatever it was in person. And perhaps he ran into some car problems in Buttonwillow, California. That's why he pulled over. That's why there's this charge at this auto repair shop. And so Karen calls the auto repair shop in Buttonwillow, and a man who worked there named Christian answered the phone. And so Karen asked him, have you seen my son? He's got red hair. He's got a tattoo on his arm. He's driving a 2003 Toyota Highlander. And Christian says, oh, yeah, we saw him a couple of hours ago. We responded to his roadside assistance call. He ran out of gas on the I-5 highway. He pulled into a rest stop, and we drove to that rest stop, and we gave him gas. And so Karen asked Christian, did my son indicate where he was going next? And Christian said, no, he didn't. We just gave him the gas and then we left. But if you'd like, I'd be more than happy to just drive over to the rest stop. It's only about 15 minutes away and see if he's still there. It's unlikely because it's been a couple of hours, but maybe. And Karen and Mike are like, oh my gosh, thank you so much. Would you do that? That would be great. And so Christian hops in his car and he drives the 15 minutes over to this rest stop. And he's not really expecting to see Bryce in this parking lot. It had been almost 3 hours. But he pulls into the lot, and there is the 2003 Toyota Highlander with Bryce sitting inside of it. He's just sitting behind the wheel, staring out into nothingness. And so Christian walks up to the driver's side, and he looks down to get Bryce's attention, and Bryce kind of snaps out of it and looks up, and he's surprised to see Christian again. He rolls the window down, and Christian says to him, hey, I just talked to your parents. They're really concerned about you. You gotta talk to them. And so Christian actually pulls out his phone and he calls Karen and says, hey, he is still here. Here he is. And he hands the phone to Bryce. And as soon as Bryce puts the phone to his ear and he says hello, Karen's like, what are you doing? What are you doing just sitting in this rest stop in the middle of Buttonwillow, California? We're so worried about you. And Bryce didn't really have an answer. He just kept telling his mom, oh, I'm not doing anything. I'm just sitting here. And so finally his mom stops trying to get information from him and just says, look, please just fill your car up with gas and come straight home, please. And Bryce says, okay, yeah, that's what I'll do. I'll do that right now. And so Bryce hands the phone back to Christian. Christian pulls it up to his ear and he says, hey, Karen, it looks like he's leaving now, so I'm going to take off. Karen thanks him and they hang up. Christian goes back into his car. He leaves the lot, and as he's driving, he looks over at Bryce, and it didn't really look like Bryce was getting ready to leave. It looked like he had just gone back to sitting and blankly staring out of his car. But Christian figured, you know what? He just talked to his mom. He said he was going to go home. I'm sure that's what he's going to do. The drive from Buttonwillow, California, south to Laguna Niguel, California, where Bryce's parents were, was about a 3-hour trip. And so the Los Pisos were expecting their son to arrive around 3 p.m. By 3:30 p.m., when he still hadn't shown up and he still hadn't called, Karen began calling her son, but he wasn't answering the phone. And as much as Karen and Mike wanted to believe their son had just gotten stuck in traffic or something like that, they knew deep down something was wrong. Something was off about his behavior. They just didn't understand what it was. For the next several hours, they continuously tried calling their son, and he never answered the phone. And so finally, by 6 p.m. that night, when he still hadn't shown up and they still couldn't get in touch with him, they called the police and they filed an official missing person report. The police began their search by contacting Bryce's cell phone provider, AT&T, and they asked them to use their cell phone towers to ping Bryce's cell phone, basically triangulate where his phone is located. And once they did that and they had the actual location of his phone, the police and Bryce's parents were shocked at where it was. It was still in Buttonwillow, California. It was located just a couple of miles down the road from that rest stop where Christian had last seen Bryce. It was now in this parking lot of this hotel. And so the police around Buttonwillow were alerted to the fact that Bryce was a missing person and his phone was apparently in this parking lot. And so police were sent over there to see if Bryce was there too. And so the police arrive in this hotel parking lot, and sure enough, right in the middle is the 2003 Toyota Highlander with Bryce sitting behind the wheel, just sitting there staring out the front. And so an officer walks up and he knocks on the glass and Bryce rolls the window down. And the officer would say Bryce acted totally normally. He was friendly, he was lucid, he answered all their questions. When he got out of the car and they conducted field sobriety tests, he passed all of them. He even said, hey, if you want to search my car, go for it. I'm not doing anything out here. And so the officers did search his car, and there were no drugs, no alcohol, there was nothing suspicious in his car. And when they asked him, what are you doing out here? Your parents are so concerned about you. And Bryce would tell them that he was just sitting there. He didn't really have much of an answer, but he told them he planned on going home soon. And so one of the officers said to him, hey, you really need to call your mom. You need to call home and let them know that you're okay. And when they told him to do that, Bryce suddenly became really apprehensive, like he did not want to call home. And the officer picked up on it. And he said, hey, you gotta tell your family what's going on. They're the reason we're out here. They're concerned about you. So get out your phone and dial your mom. And so Bryce reluctantly pulled his phone out. He dialed his mother's number and he hit call. And the officer said, give me the phone. So Bryce hands over the phone. The officer picks it up. Karen answers the phone. And the officer tells her, hey, look, I'm with your son. He's just fine. He's sober. There's no drugs. There's no alcohol. I don't really know what he's doing, but he says he's going to go home pretty soon. But there's nothing wrong about the situation that I can tell. You need to talk to your son and figure out what's going on. And so he hands the phone over to Bryce. Bryce picks it up. And Karen says to him, what's going on? Why are you still in Buttonwillow? It's been like 9 hours. And Bryce really didn't give her an answer to any of her questions. He just kind of deflected all of them and said he'd be home soon and don't worry about it. I'm just sitting here. There's nothing to worry about. And so finally, Karen just stopped trying to pull information out of her son. She could tell that, again, he was not going to tell her what's going on. And so she changed her tactic and she told her son very gently, Bryce, please just go get a bite to eat, get a cup of coffee, kind of get yourself together here, and then please just drive home. It's only a few hours away. Drive home and we can talk about whatever problems you have, but you just got to drive home. You got to leave Buttonwillow. You got to come home. And at this, Bryce says to his mom, you know what? Okay, I'm sorry. I'll be home in a few hours. And so they hang up, and the officer, who was kind of eavesdropping intentionally on this conversation to make sure everything was fine, the officer was satisfied that everything was fine, that Bryce was sober, that he would head home. And so he says, okay, Bryce, best of luck, head home to your parents. And the officer left. An hour later, Karen received a call from Christian, the car repairman who had checked on Bryce earlier. And he was actually returning one of Karen's calls. She'd called him sometime and he didn't get back to her. And so he was calling back and he wanted to know, had Bryce made it home safely? Because now it's been several hours from when he saw him last. And Karen would tell Christian, actually, no. After you left, my son did not leave Buttonwillow. He just went down the road to a parking lot. But, the police actually were just over there. They checked on him. And now I'm certain he's making his way home. Christian, who felt kind of invested in what was happening with Bryce, would say to Karen, hey, I don't mind driving over there and just confirming he has left this parking lot. But Karen would say, you know what? I'm confident he's on his way. Don't worry about it. You're too kind. So they hang up, and afterwards, Christian, even though he didn't have to, he decides, I'm going to go over there and make sure Bryce really has left, because obviously something strange is going on here, and if there is some problem, maybe I can assist. And so he drives over to this hotel parking lot, and he really was not expecting to see Bryce there. But he pulls into the lot, and who's still in the middle of the lot but Bryce in his 2003 Toyota Highlander, just staring out the front of his car. And so this time, Christian pulls up right next to him, he parks the car, he walks right up to the window, and he's a little bit more forceful, friendly, but forceful with Bryce. He has him roll the window down, and Bryce obviously is very surprised to see Christian again. It's the third time he's seen this car repairman, and Christian says to him, hey, Bryce, you need to go home. Your parents are so worried about you. You need to leave right now. In fact, I'm going to watch you leave, and then I'm going to follow you onto the highway to make sure you're going home. And so Bryce was a little bit taken aback at how forceful he was being, but he would ultimately say, okay, yeah, all right, let's leave. And so Christian gets back in his car and he goes right behind Bryce. And after a few seconds, Bryce pulls out of the lot and he starts driving onto the road, and Christian follows him. And for the next hour, Christian would just remain behind Bryce and watch him drive towards Laguna Niguel. And while he was driving, Christian would actually call Karen and Mike back. And he would say to them that, your son had not left, but now he's good. He's on the highway. I'm right behind him. He'll be home soon. And so when Christian and Bryce made it to the last leg on the way to Laguna Niguel, Christian was confident that Bryce was fine and he would get home under his own steam. He wasn't driving erratically. Everything seemed normal. And so Christian pulled up alongside Bryce. He kind of waved to him to say, I'm leaving. And then he turned around and he headed back to Buttonwillow. Shortly after this, Karen called Bryce. Bryce picked up the phone. He's still driving. And Karen tells him, okay, you're going to give me landmarks of the things you're seeing as you're driving so that I know you're actually driving home. But Bryce refused to give them to her. He would say, I can't see anything out my window. It's too dark and I don't know where anything is. And so despite Karen and Mike getting so frustrated with him, saying, come on, tell us something, give us a sign, a road sign, anything, tell us anything around you. But Bryce didn't give them any information. And so finally, at about 2 a.m., when Bryce really should have been in Laguna Niguel or very close, he tells his parents over the phone that he's too tired to continue and he needs to pull over and take a nap. At first, his parents urged him to just keep on going. Come home, you can sleep as long as you want when you get here. But as they were saying it, they realized their son had been awake for nearly 24 hours at this point, and it's the middle of the night, so it does kind of make sense for him to pull over and take a nap. And so they say, okay, pull over, but as soon as you wake up, you need to call us so we know you're back on the road. So Bryce says, no problem, I'll do that. And they hang up. Several hours later, at 8 a.m., Karen and Mike have still not heard from their son, and they're telling themselves that he's probably just sleeping, he's totally exhausted, I'm sure he's fine. And then they hear their doorbell ring, and they're immediately so relieved because they're thinking, Bryce is here. He's finally arrived, thank goodness. They run to the door, they open it up, and it's not Bryce, it's a police officer. And the officer asks them, do you own a 2003 Toyota Highlander car? And so Mike and Karen's hearts sank and they say, yes, our son Bryce drives that car. The officer told them that the car had been located a few hours earlier at the bottom of a 25-foot cliff near Castaic Lake. Castaic Lake is about halfway between Buttonwillow and Laguna Niguel. They told the parents that there was no sign of a driver. Bryce was not there. They did find 2 small drops of blood inside the vehicle, but beyond that, there was no indication that Bryce had sustained life-threatening injuries from this crash. They said the back window of the vehicle had been broken from the inside, indicating that Bryce had escaped the wreck by punching out that window. His laptop and phone were still in the vehicle, and his wallet and duffel bag were outside the vehicle on the road and looked like they had been rummaged through before they were left there. After an examination of the damage to the car, the final tire tracks that led down to where it had been found, and traffic cameras in the area, it was concluded that Bryce had actually intentionally driven off this cliff, and he had actually hit the accelerator right before he went over the edge. After Mike and Karen headed out to the crash scene and had a chance to talk to some of the investigators that had been looking for Bryce, they informed the parents that most likely what they were looking at with this crash was a failed suicide attempt. But Mike and Karen, they just couldn't buy that. That was not like their son. And just 2 weeks earlier, when they dropped him off, he was happy, he was excited to be at school, he was talking about the future. He was not someone that was suicidal. And so what situation could he have possibly gotten himself into in just those 2 weeks that was so bad it would lead to something like this? It made investigators and the parents wonder, was Bryce hiding something? What did he mean when he said he had a lot to talk about? Did that have something to do with this thing he was hiding? A huge search was launched in and around the area where the car had been found, with hundreds of people on horseback, on ATV, on foot. There were helicopters in the air. They put divers in the lake. I mean, they looked everywhere for days and days and days, but nothing was found of Bryce. On the 9th day of the search, they brought a bloodhound out to see if it could pick up Bryce's scent, and sure enough, it did, right at the crash site. And the dog followed the scent all the way down to the lake. It walked around the lake to this bridge. It was actually a dam that went across the lake. It followed his scent right across the bridge to the other side, and then it kept on following it up this small access road until it reached a truck stop, and then his scent just stopped. And so police and the parents and everyone involved in this investigation was really surprised at this discovery. And so police got another bloodhound, a separate bloodhound. They brought it out to see if it could do the same thing, to prove that this really was his scent trail. And sure enough, the bloodhound picked up his scent. It went down to the lake, it went around to the bridge, went over, went to the truck stop, and then it just stopped. But after the scent trail was discovered, there was no other leads for anyone to follow. And so after 3 weeks of looking everywhere for Bryce, the search was called off. Some say Bryce was suicidal. That's why he drove off the cliff. That was a suicide attempt. And despite the bloodhounds picking up his scent, Bryce was most likely in the lake somewhere. Others disagree and say Bryce is still alive, that after this crash, he gets out of the car and he walks down to the lake, he walks around to that bridge, he goes up to the truck stop, and then he hitches a ride with someone and vanishes, and now he's living off the grid somewhere. And still others believe Bryce's drug and alcohol use caused a psychotic break, and that was what was causing all this strange behavior, and that was what led him to drive off the cliff. And perhaps when he landed, he sustained a vicious head wound that caused him to forget who he was, and so now he's just kind of wandering around somewhere, not knowing who he is or knowing that he's a missing person. As for his parents, they say he would never do this on purpose. He would never cause this much pain to the people that love him, and so he must have been a victim of foul play. But regardless of what you believe happened to Bryce, something happened to him, and it's probably connected to whatever it was he said he needed to talk to his mom about. That thing that he couldn't discuss on the phone that potentially he was trying to drive home to talk to his mom and dad in person about. But unless we find Bryce and he's still alive, it's unlikely we'll ever know what it was.
Thank you for taking the time to watch the video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like, comment, and subscribe to the channel for more content. Your support means a lot to us and helps us create more videos that you'll love. We appreciate your feedback and would love to hear your thoughts on the video. What did you like about it? What could we improve? Your feedback will help us create better content in the future. If you're interested in seeing more videos like this, please subscribe to our channel. We post new videos every week, so you'll always have something new to watch. Once again, thank you for watching and supporting our channel. We hope to see you again soon. Smiling face.